Deep in the frozen Altai mountains, a small cave held a secret that waited for tens of thousands of years. Not a city, not a tomb, not a painted wall, just fragments of bone, teeth, ash, and ancient dirt. But when scientists looked closer, one tiny piece of bone revealed a lost kind of human no one knew had existed. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy ancient mysteries, lost worlds, and the hidden story of humanity. Because this cave did not just change archaeology, it changed what we thought it meant to be human. Snow lies in the folds of the Altai mountains like ash from an ancient fire. Pale and wind-packed across the slopes, gathered on the dark shoulders of limestone cliffs. The cave mouth opens above a river valley, not grand enough to look like the entrance to a lost world, not wide enough to announce that it is holding one of the most unsettling secrets in human prehistory. It is simply there, a hollow in the stone, facing the cold light, breathing out the damp smell of earth, animal bone, old smoke, and mineral dust. For thousands of years, creatures come and go through this opening. Hyenas drag carcasses into the shadows. Bears sleep through winters beneath the rock. Human hands strike flakes from stone, carry meat, tend fires, leave scraps behind, and disappear into a landscape that never stays still for long. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story that begins here is not just about a cave. It is about how a small place on the edge of Siberia forced scientists to redraw the human past, and how the ground beneath one chamber held a truth that no one had been looking for. Denisova Cave sits in the Altai region of southern Siberia, near the meeting ground of forests, steppe, rivers, and mountains. Today, the valley can seem remote, almost sealed away from the urgency of the modern world, but in deep time it is not isolated in the way a map might suggest. It stands near natural corridors that open towards Central Asia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and the great spaces beyond. During warmer phases, grasslands spread and animals follow them. During colder phases, ice and dry winds reshape the world, pushing life into refuges and routes where food can still be found. The cave becomes a kind of sheltering notch in a restless continent, not a monument built by ambition, but something older and more revealing a place where survival leaves traces. At first glance, its importance comes from ordinary archaeological promise. Caves are useful because they protect. A tool dropped on an open plain may be scattered, buried too deeply, washed away, crushed, or lost in the movement of soil. But a cave can hold layers like pages pressed together. Dust settles, ash spreads, bones break and remain. Stone flakes fall beside hearths. Rain carries fine sediment inward. Animals disturb some areas. Frost cracks others. But still the chamber keeps a record that open ground rarely preserves. The evidence remains incomplete, always damaged by time and chance, yet it survives with unusual patience. To an excavator, each layer is not just dirt, it is weather, habit, hunger, accident, return. This is where the discovery gains its quiet power. Nothing in Denisova Cave at first demands a revolution. It does not present a painted ceiling like a European Ice Age sanctuary. It does not offer a buried palace, a king's tomb, or walls covered in writing. It gives up fragments, a chipped stone edge, a splinter of bone, a tooth with roots heavy and strange, charcoal from old fires, sediment that looks, to the untrained eye, like compacted dust. Yet the human past is often changed by fragments, not by grand scenes. Archaeology is a discipline of patience, and sometimes the smallest object in a tray is the one that breaks the old map. The disturbance begins beneath the floor. Archaeologists working through the cave's deposits recover material from layers formed over many thousands of years. The work is slow, careful, often physically unglamorous. Sediment is loosened, documented, sifted, bagged, labelled. Context matters as much as the object itself, because a fragment without a layer loses part of its voice. The chamber does not give its secrets freely. It asks for brushes, notebooks, sieves, cold fingers, aching backs, and the humility to treat a small scrap as if it might matter. Most pieces do not change the world. Many are catalogued, studied, and placed into the patient accumulation of evidence. Then one piece refuses to stay ordinary. The strange thing is that the cave's power does not come only from what can be seen. For most of human history as a science, bones have carried the greatest authority. A skull can define a face, a jaw can show diet, age, and kinship. But Denisova Cave becomes famous at a moment when a new kind of evidence is beginning to speak with astonishing force. Ancient DNA, fragile and easily contaminated, can survive in cold conditions long enough to reveal relationships that the eye cannot read. It can show that a bone that looks unimpressive belongs to a lineage no one expected. It can uncover contact between human groups that never left behind written memory, monuments, or complete skeletons. It can turn a cave floor into an archive of vanished bloodlines. That is what makes Denisova so unsettling. The cave does not merely add one more fossil to the cabinet. It suggests that the cabinet itself has been too small. Somewhere in these layers is evidence for a population that is not exactly Neanderthal, not exactly modern human, and not simply a minor variation of what is already known. It is close enough to us to belong in the human family, distant enough to force a new name, and elusive enough to remain half hidden. Scholars still debate the full shape of this group's body, its range, its culture, and the reasons it vanished as a distinct population. What survives in the record suggests a human world far more crowded and entangled than the older stories allowed. And absence is everywhere in this story. Most lives leave nothing. Most bodies vanish into soil, water, scavengers, frost, and time. Most camps are erased. The reason Denisova Cave matters is not that it gives a complete answer, but that it preserves enough to make the missing world visible at its edges. In its sediments, the past does not appear as a clean portrait. It appears as a shadow crossing a wall, a footprint filling with dust, a signal buried in bone. The discovery that changes everything is still waiting in the tray, small enough to be overlooked, but the cave has already prepared the ground for it. Beneath the quiet limestone roof, the old human story is about to widen, and the first sign is not a skull, not a weapon, not a painted hand, but a fragment carried out of the dark. Long before the cave becomes a scientific landmark, Eurasia is a continent in motion, not because its mountains are moving fast enough for human eyes to notice, but because climate keeps remaking the rules of survival. Ice grows and retreats across the north. Grasslands expand, then shrink. Forests climb into valleys during warmer spells and withdraw when cold returns. Rivers shift their courses, lakes rise and vanish, and the animals that humans depend on follow invisible lines of water. Forage, shelter, and season. A valley that can feed a band for generations may become too dry, too exposed, or too crowded. A route that once opens across steppe may close beneath ice, swamp, or hunger. In this world, human groups do not spread like ink across a blank map. They move in pulses, pauses, retreats, and returns. The Altai sits near one of these great meeting zones. For Ice Age people, geography has a power deeper than politics. The mountains gather streams and animals, valleys offer protection from wind, uplands give stone, caves, vantage points, and temporary refuge. The region lies between ecological worlds, where taiga, steppe, and highland terrain touch one another. That variety matters. When one environment becomes harsh, another may still offer something useful. Reindeer, wild horses, bison, ibex, woolly rhinoceroses, and mammoths move through the larger landscape, and behind them come predators and people, each reading the land in their own way. Across this immense Pleistocene world, there is no single humanity. That is the fact Denisova Cave will later make impossible to ignore. But even before the decisive evidence appears, the old continent already carries hints of complexity. Neanderthals occupy large parts of Western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, adapted to cold climates, skilled at making tools, butchering animals, controlling fire, and living in small groups across difficult terrain. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerge in Africa much earlier than their widespread rival in Eurasia, and eventually begin expanding beyond Africa in movements still being refined by archaeology and genetics. Other human forms appear in the wider story as well, some known from fossils, some only dimly suggested. The evidence remains incomplete, and every new discovery exposes how much the record has lost. The older picture once seemed simpler. There were Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, modern humans arriving later, and a long drama of replacement, survival, and extinction. It was never quite that neat, but it was easier to imagine. Bones could be sorted into categories. Stone tool traditions could be grouped and given names. The story could be drawn as branching lines, each population occupying its own place until one vanished and another endured. But Ice Age reality resists clean borders. Populations meet at margins. Small bands split and rejoin. Tools move from hand to hand. Ideas can travel without large migrations, and genes can travel through encounters so brief that no campsite would preserve them clearly. To understand the cave, it helps to imagine not a crowded city, but a vast, thinly inhabited world. Human population densities are low. A person may know the valleys, ridges, water sources, and animal paths of a homeland intimately, yet be separated from another human group by enormous distances. Contact is possible, but never guaranteed. A band might cross another group's old camp only after the fires have gone cold. They might exchange mates, tools, gestures, or nothing at all. The archaeological record rarely preserves the human tension of these moments. It leaves behind flakes of stone, burned bone, worn teeth, and sometimes the remains of bodies. From such traces, scholars infer lives that were immediate, fragile, and alert. The climate presses on all of them. During glacial periods, much of northern Eurasia becomes colder, drier, and more open, a world of steppe tundra where herds can be abundant but conditions unforgiving. This so-called mammoth steppe is not a simple frozen wasteland. It can be rich in grasses, herbs, and hardy vegetation, supporting large herbivores across huge spaces. But richness does not mean comfort. Winters are dangerous, shelter is precious, fuel may be scarce in open environments. Making bone, dung, shrubs, and driftwood valuable where trees are limited, a cave like Denisova offers more than darkness. It offers a windbreak, a dry floor in some seasons, and a protected chamber where firelight can turn stone walls into a temporary boundary between the living and everything outside. Warmer periods bring different possibilities. Trees return, animals change their ranges, valleys may become easier for some groups and less useful for others. The rhythms of prey, water, and plant shift again. These changes do not happen like a switch in a single human lifetime. Though abrupt events can occur, often they unfold across generations, altering inherited knowledge slowly enough that people adapt without ever seeing the entire transformation. A hunting route passed down from elders may become less reliable. A familiar herd may arrive later or not at all. What survives in the record suggests resilience, but also vulnerability. Ice Age humans are capable, inventive, and socially intelligent, yet they are never separate from the environmental systems around them. This is one reason caves can mislead as well as reveal. A cave may preserve traces from many different visitors, but it does not automatically show how those visitors understood the place. One group may use it briefly during hunting trips, another may return for generations, Animals may occupy it between human visits. Sediments can mix. Later activity can disturb earlier layers. A stone tool style may look familiar, but belong to people whose bones are absent. Scholars still debate many details of how to connect artifacts, dates, and human populations in such complicated sites. Denisova Cave is extraordinary, but it is not a perfect archive. It is a damaged archive, and that is part of its power. Before the famous fragment speaks, the world around it is already filled with vanished movement. Neanderthals are not brutish shadows waiting to be replaced. Modern humans are not yet the obvious inheritors of everything. Unknown relatives may be moving across Asia without leaving enough bones for anyone to recognize them by shape alone. The Altai landscape receives them in turns, perhaps in overlap, perhaps in gaps of centuries, perhaps in patterns still hidden from view. Fires are lit and cold ashes remain. Meat is cut from bone. Stone edges are struck and discarded. Outside, snow falls, melts, and returns. Inside the cave, layer by layer, the continent's human complexity settles into the floor, waiting for a future age to learn that the old family tree has been growing in the dark. Among all the things a cave can preserve, the object that changes the story is almost embarrassingly small. It is not the kind of fossil that would stop a visitor in a museum gallery. It does not carry the dramatic authority of a skull, with empty eye sockets and a face that seems to look back across time. It is not a complete hand, not a jaw lined with teeth, not a skeleton folded into the earth with tools nearby. It is a tiny piece of finger bone, the end of a child's little finger, found in a layer of Denisova Cave where other traces of ancient occupation already suggest that humans have come and gone through the chamber again and again. In another setting, in another century, it might have been sorted, labelled, and understood only as a small human fragment from an Ice Age site. Important, yes, but not world-shaking. Its power lies in what cannot be seen. To the eye, the bone is limited. It tells almost nothing about height, face, posture, strength, or the shape of the body that once carried it. It belongs to a young individual, likely a girl. But beyond that, the visible evidence is meagre. The fragment is too small to build a species around in the old anatomical way. There is no brow ridge to compare, no limb proportions to measure, no full hand to study. It is a remnant that seems to ask for modesty. A careful scientist could describe it, date the layer as best as possible, place it within the cave sequence, and then admit that the evidence remains incomplete. But by the early 21st century, the smallest bones are beginning to matter in a new way. Ancient DNA research has become one of the most powerful tools in the study of human origins, though it is also one of the most delicate. DNA degrades after death. Heat, moisture, microbes, and time break it into fragments. Modern contamination can easily confuse the signal. A fingertip handled carelessly can carry more recent human genetic material than ancient molecules from the fossil itself. Cold environments help preservation, and the Siberian context offers a better chance than many warmer regions. But nothing is guaranteed. The work requires clean rooms, controls, repeated testing, and caution. No single explanation and no single laboratory result should be accepted casually when the claim is extraordinary. This is why the Denisova finger bone becomes so remarkable. Researchers do not simply look at it and decide it is different. They extract genetic material and compare it with known patterns from modern humans and Neanderthals. At first, the mitochondrial DNA, inherited through the maternal line, gives a shock. It does not fit neatly with either group. It is related, of course, because all these humans share deep ancestry. But it branches away in a way that suggests a population distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. Later, nuclear DNA, carrying a broader record of ancestry, confirms that this is not just a strange mitochondrial accident. The fragment belongs to a previously unknown kind of ancient human relative, one close enough to be part of our wider family, but separate enough to demand a new place in the story. The name comes from the cave, Denisovans. It is a practical name, almost plain, tied to geography rather than appearance, because appearance is exactly what the fossil does not provide. This is one of the lesser-known strangenesses of the discovery a major human group enters science not with a reconstructed face, not with a dramatic skeleton laid out in stone, but through genetic sequence. For a long time, Denisovans are known more like a signal than a body. They are a population detected through code, a vanished branch first recognized through molecules hidden in a child's bone. It is a strangely modern way to meet an ancient people. The fragment also changes the emotional scale of the cave. Until then, the human past might seem to unfold in broad categories. Neanderthals here, modern humans there, maybe an older form somewhere farther away. But this bone belongs to a child. That detail narrows the distance. The individual was not a scientific category, not an abstract lineage, not a label in a diagram. She had a body that grew, needed food, warmth, and protection, and moved through a world of stone, smoke, animals, and cold. She may never have travelled far from the region, or her people may have ranged widely. Scholars still debate the life patterns of Denisovans because the evidence remains so limited. Yet for a brief moment, the fragment makes one life visible enough to alter the fate of an entire field. Dating the context of such finds is also complicated. Cave layers are not always simple stacks of untouched time. Sediment can be disturbed by animal burrowing, freeze-thaw cycles, human digging, and natural movement within the cave. Different dating methods may refine or challenge earlier estimates. What survives in the record suggests that Denisovans occupied or visited Denisova Cave across a long span of time, but the exact timing of every object and every fragment must be handled carefully. The finger bone is not a magic key that unlocks all questions at once. It is a key that opens one door and reveals many more doors beyond it. Still, after this discovery, the old map cannot be restored. The small fragment proves that an unknown human population had existed, close enough to Neanderthals and modern humans to share a deep evolutionary background, yet genetically distinct. It also raises an immediate and unsettling question. If such a population can be found from one tiny piece of bone in one cave, how many other groups have disappeared without leaving any recognizable fossil record at all? How many human histories were erased before they could be named? The Denisovan discovery does not merely add a branch. It exposes the poverty of the surviving evidence, the enormous silence surrounding most ancient lives, and the risk of mistaking absence for simplicity. In the cold logic of excavation, the fragment is a specimen. It has a layer, a catalogue number, a laboratory history. But in the larger story, it is closer to a whisper from a lost crowd. It says that the cave held more than repeated visits. It held a human presence that science had not imagined clearly enough to seek. The smallest revolutionary fossil does not look revolutionary at all. It rests quietly in the chain of evidence, a sliver from a child's hand. While around it the human family tree begins to bend, split, and tangle. The past has not changed, but the story people tell about it has, and that change begins with something small enough to fit almost unnoticed in the palm of a modern hand. The first shock of the Denisova bone is that it belongs to someone unknown. The second shock is worse once the DNA is compared more widely. The unknown does not stay confined to one cave. It begins to reach outward, into Neanderthals, into modern humans, into people living thousands of miles from the Altai, and into the uncomfortable realization that the human past is not shaped like a clean tree. For generations, the image of human evolution had been drawn with lines branching away from one another, each species taking its path until one line, ours, reached the present. The diagram was useful, but Denisovan DNA makes it feel too tidy, almost too polite. The real pattern looks less like a tree standing alone in an open field and more like a thicket, with branches touching, crossing, breaking, and growing through one another. Ancient DNA does not tell this story in the language of bones. It speaks through comparison. Scientists examine differences and similarities across genomes, measuring how one population relates to another, how long ago lineages may have separated, and where traces of ancient mixture remain. The method is powerful, but it is not magic. Genetic signals can be faint. Later populations move, mix, shrink, and expand. Some ancestry survives strongly in one region and nearly vanishes in another. Scholars still debate the precise timing and geography of many events, because DNA can reveal contact without preserving the place, season, or human circumstances in which that contact happened. It can show that people met. It cannot show the fire they sat beside, the route they took, or whether the meeting lasted a day, a generation, or many centuries. Even with those limits, the message is unmistakable. Denisovans are not an isolated curiosity. They are part of a wider human network. Their DNA shows that they shared ancestors with Neanderthals, and both groups shared deeper ancestry with modern humans. But the Denisovan lineage had been separate long enough to become genetically distinct. This alone would have been a major discovery. Yet the more unsettling finding is that separation did not mean permanent isolation. Ancient human groups who had diverged over immense spans of time could meet again. When they did, they could have children. Some of those children survived. Some of their descendants carried the genetic traces forward until they entered the bodies of living people. This changes the meaning of extinction. A group can vanish as a distinct population and still leave part of itself behind. The Denisovans are gone in the sense that no living community is simply Denisovan. No language, tradition, or self-name survives from them, and no full skeleton has stepped out of the earth to give them a complete form. But fragments of their ancestry remain in modern human genomes, especially in populations across parts of Asia and Oceania. In some communities, the Denisovan contribution is small but real. In others, especially among peoples of Melanesia and nearby regions, it is noticeably higher. What survives in the record suggests that encounters between modern humans and Denisovans happened somewhere in Asia, perhaps more than once, and perhaps with different Denisovan populations. The evidence remains incomplete, but it points toward a geography far larger than one Siberian cave. This is where the older story of modern human expansion becomes more complicated. The old version could be told as a dramatic outward movement. Homo sapiens leaves Africa, spreads into Eurasia, replaces other human groups, and eventually becomes the only human species left. There is truth in the broad outline, but Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA show that replacement was not simple erasure. It involved contact and absorption. Modern humans did not walk into an empty world. They entered landscapes already known by other humans, landscapes with their own histories of adaptation, migration, and survival. In some places, they may have avoided one another. In others, they may have competed. In others still, they mixed, leaving no story except the one preserved in inheritance. There is a strange intimacy in that. Deep prehistory often feels distant because the names are scientific and the timescales are vast, but DNA collapses some of that distance. It says that the vanished were not merely neighbours in a broad ecological sense. They became ancestors, not ancestors to everyone equally, not in a simple universal line, but ancestors all the same. A tiny fraction of Denisovan ancestry in a modern genome is not a fossil in a museum case. It is biological memory, copied through countless births, surviving long after the people who first carried it lost their separate identity. No single explanation fully accounts for why some Denisovan genetic traces persisted while others vanished. But natural selection, population history, chance, and repeated mixing all likely shape the pattern. The discovery also unsettles the boundary around the word human. For a long time, popular imagination liked hard divisions. Neanderthals were one kind, modern humans another, and anything else belonged to an earlier or stranger category. Denisova makes those divisions harder to defend in simple terms. These groups were different, but not so different that contact ended at the edge of biology. They had been separated long enough for distinct lineages to form, yet close enough that interbreeding could produce living descendants. That does not mean all ancient humans were the same. It means the story is more braided than once believed. There is also a deeper warning here. Denisovans were recognized because conditions allowed DNA to survive, because researchers had the tools to read it, and because one small fragment happened to be found. Without that chain of luck and science, they might have remained invisible. Their existence raises the possibility that other lost human populations moved across Asia, Africa, or island worlds with little or no surviving fossil evidence. Some may be known only indirectly through unusual genetic signals, sometimes called ghost populations, because they are detected by their influence rather than by their bones. The term sounds almost supernatural, but the science behind it is sober. It is a way of admitting that the dead can shape the living even when their bodies are gone. Denisova Cave therefore becomes more than a site. It becomes a warning against overconfidence. The human family tree had not been wrong because scientists were careless. It had been incomplete because the evidence was incomplete. The finger bone did not destroy the old story so much as expose its missing rooms. It forced a new kind of humility, one in which prehistory is understood as a landscape of overlapping human experiments, some ending in disappearance, some flowing into others, all shaped by climate, distance, adaptation, and chance. The DNA does not give Denisovans a face yet, but it gives them a presence. It shows that they were not a footnote in Siberian sediment. They were part of the making of us, not as a single heroic ancestor, but as one of the hidden threads in a much older fabric. The strangest thing about Denisovans is not that they were discovered late. Many ancient peoples have waited in the ground for centuries before anyone recognized them. The stranger fact is that, even after their discovery, they remain almost faceless. Neanderthals have faces. Their heavy brows, large noses, strong bodies, and broad chests have been reconstructed again and again, sometimes crudely, sometimes with real scientific care. Early modern humans have skulls, burials, tools, ornaments, and painted caves that allow the imagination to settle around them. Even much older human relatives, known from broken jaws or partial skeletons, can sometimes be given a rough outline. Denisovans, by contrast, enter the world as a genetic presence before they become an anatomical one. They are known first not by a face, but by a sequence. That creates an unusual problem. Science can say that Denisovans existed. It can say they were close relatives of Neanderthals, that they also mixed with ancestors of some modern humans, and that their ancestry still survives in living populations. It can say that they lived in or near Denisova Cave and likely ranged far beyond it. But what did they look like when they stood in the cave mouth, watching snow move across the valley? How tall were they? How broad were their shoulders? Did their faces resemble Neanderthals more than modern humans? Or did they carry features that would surprise us completely? The evidence remains incomplete, and for a long time the answer is almost painfully limited. No one knows enough to draw them with confidence. The fossils tied to Denisovans are few: a finger bone fragment, some teeth, pieces of jaw or skull from other sites debated or linked through DNA and protein analysis, and scattered remains that must be interpreted cautiously. One of the better-known Denisovan clues from the cave is a molar, unusually large compared with many modern human teeth. Large teeth alone do not define a species, and dental size can vary, but the tooth hints at a body that may not have matched simple expectations. Another Denisovan fossil, a mandible from the Tibetan Plateau identified through ancient protein evidence rather than preserved DNA, suggests that Denisovan-like populations reached harsh, high-altitude environments. Yet even this jaw does not give a complete face. It gives a curve of bone, a dental arcade, a presence on a cold plateau, and another reminder that the group was not confined to one Siberian chamber. This is one of the quiet frustrations in paleoanthropology. The public often wants a portrait. A face makes the past feel reachable. A reconstructed head in a museum case can give the illusion of meeting someone. But reconstructions are only as good as the bones beneath them. And when the bones are missing, imagination can become too eager. Scientists can infer some traits from genetic data, and attempts have been made to predict aspects of Denisovan anatomy through patterns of gene regulation. But such work remains complex and debated. Genes influence bodies, but they do not translate into a finished face with the simplicity of a sculptor following instructions. Scholars still debate how much can safely be inferred. The responsible answer is less satisfying, but more honest Denisovans were real, human, and distinct. Yet their full appearance remains partly hidden. That hiddenness gives them a strange power. They resist the old habit of turning ancient human relatives into simple characters. Neanderthals have often been forced into roles they did not deserve: brute, victim, rival, cousin, misunderstood genius. Modern humans become the restless innovators. Other species become stepping stones. Denisovans do not yet fit into these images. They arrive as a question mark with ancestry attached. This makes them harder to misuse, but also harder to imagine. They were not ghosts in the supernatural sense. They ate, aged, moved, suffered injuries, knew landscapes, and left remains. Yet because their bodies are mostly absent, they hover in the story as a kind of negative space, defined by the outline of what evidence has not preserved. The cave itself deepens that uncertainty. Denisova Cave contains artifacts from different periods, and the challenge is to know who made what. A polished stone bracelet, bone tools, pendants, and ornaments have been found in its layers, some of them sophisticated enough to attract enormous attention. But assigning objects to Denisovans, Neanderthals, or modern humans is difficult unless there is secure dating and direct association with identifiable remains. A beautiful artifact in a Denisovan-bearing layer does not automatically prove a Denisovan hand made it. Sediments shift, layers can be disturbed, and different groups may use the same cave across long spans. What survives in the record suggests complex behaviour in the region, but no single object should be forced to carry more certainty than it can bear. Even so, it would be a mistake to imagine Denisovans as primitive shadows simply because their faces are unknown. Genetic evidence shows they were part of a long-lasting human lineage, one capable of surviving across difficult environments and interacting with other human groups. Their descendants' traces in modern populations show that they were not biological dead ends in the simplest sense. Their possible presence across vast parts of Asia suggests adaptability. The Tibetan Plateau connection, if understood correctly, is especially striking, because high-altitude life is not easy for any human body. Thin air tests the lungs, blood, heart, pregnancy, childhood growth, and daily labour. The idea that Denisovan inheritance may have helped later humans live at altitude turns an unseen people into a source of survival. Still, the absence of a face matters. It reminds us that discovery does not always mean possession. Modern science has named Denisovans, sequenced them, compared them, and traced parts of their legacy. But naming is not the same as knowing completely. The people themselves had no idea they would someday be defined by a cave in Siberia. They did not call themselves Denisovans. They did not live as a genetic category. They lived inside immediate worlds of weather, hunger, memory, kinship, danger, and habit. Their identity, language, gestures, and stories are gone. The name we use is a handle attached to fragments. That may be the most humbling part of the discovery. Denisovans reveal how much can be known from almost nothing, and how much remains unknowable even after a revolution. A tiny bone can expose an entire branch of humanity. A tooth can hint at bodily difference. A jaw can extend a range into mountains. Sediment can preserve traces of presence without a skeleton at all. Yet the person standing in the cave mouth remains beyond reach. The wind touches a face we cannot reconstruct. Firelight moves across features we cannot see. Somewhere between the certainty of DNA and the silence of missing bones, Denisovans become one of the most important discoveries in human origins, people proven beyond serious doubt, but still waiting for their face to return from the dark. Denisova Cave is not a house in the ordinary sense, not a permanent village, not a place where one people builds walls and declares possession across the centuries. It is older than ownership. It belongs first to the mountain, then to weather, animals, darkness, and the slow patience of stone. Human beings enter it in intervals, separated sometimes by years, sometimes by centuries, sometimes by spans so long that no memory could possibly connect one visit to another. A fire burns, then fades. Bones are cracked for marrow, then covered by dust. A tool is lost near the wall. A child steps where another human relative may have stepped thousands of years earlier. The cave gathers these moments without explaining them, and that is what makes it so extraordinary. It is not the cave of one vanished people. It is a place where several kinds of humans appear to have crossed the same threshold. This is the point where Denisova becomes more than a discovery site. It becomes a meeting ground, though not necessarily in the simple dramatic way imagination prefers. The evidence suggests that Denisovans used the cave, Neanderthals used the cave, and modern humans later entered the wider region as well. But the timing is uneven, and the layers are complicated. No one should picture all three groups sitting together in the chamber as if gathered for a planned encounter. The record does not give that scene. What survives in the record suggests something subtler and perhaps more powerful. The same landscape drew different human populations across deep time, and the cave preserved enough traces to show that the Altai was not a human backwater, but a zone of repeated presence, movement, and possible contact. Neanderthal DNA from Denisova Cave and nearby sites reveals that these Western Eurasian relatives reached farther east than many older views once emphasized. They were not confined to the caves of France or the valleys of Spain. Their world stretched across a huge range, from Europe into parts of Western and Central Asia, shaped by climate pulses and survival routes. In the Altai, they encountered environments very different from the classic image of Neanderthal huddled near European cliffs. Here were mountain valleys, cold forests, open grasslands, and migratory herds moving through long seasonal rhythms. The presence of Neanderthals in this region shows a flexibility that older stereotypes failed to respect. They were not merely survivors of one narrow habitat. They were skilled inhabitants of a changing continent. Denisovans, meanwhile, appear in the same cave sequence as something both local and mysterious. The cave gives them their name, but not their full range. Their DNA in modern populations implies that their world likely extended far beyond the Altai, perhaps across much of Asia in forms and branches still poorly known. Scholars still debate how many Denisovan populations existed, how different they were from one another, and where modern humans encountered them. The Altai Denisovans may not represent all Denisovans any more than one medieval village represents all of Europe. This is a lesser-known but crucial point. The genetic signals suggest Denisovan diversity, meaning that the people identified in Siberia may have been only one part of a much wider and older human landscape. Inside the cave, the challenge is that presence does not always equal meeting. A Neanderthal group may have used the chamber during one climatic phase, then vanished from the area long before Denisovans returned. Denisovans may have occupied or visited it repeatedly without ever seeing a modern human. Modern humans may have arrived later, inheriting a landscape already layered with the debris of other human lives. The evidence remains incomplete, and cave sediments rarely behave like perfect calendars. Material can move. Burrowing animals can disturb old deposits. Water, frost, and human activity can blur boundaries that archaeologists must then patiently untangle. Yet even with these cautions, Denisova Cave preserves a rare pattern. Different human lineages are not abstract branches separated neatly on a chart. They are tied to the same physical place. That physical place matters. A cave like Denisova would have offered practical advantages across generations. It sits near routes through the mountains, with access to water, stone, animals, and shelter. Its entrance receives light, while its interior offers protection. For mobile hunter-gatherers, such a place may have served many purposes: a temporary camp, a lookout, a refuge during bad weather, a butchery spot, a place to repair tools, or a shelter returned to because ancestors, though not remembered as such, had also found it useful. Different groups could discover the same advantages independently. The cave does not need to be sacred or symbolic to become important. Sometimes geography itself is enough to create repetition. Still, the thought of repeated human presence carries a quiet emotional force. Imagine one group entering the cave and finding traces left by another. Not inscriptions, not clear messages, but old ash, bones split by hands, stone flakes from a style slightly different from their own. Would they recognize these as human traces? Would they care? The archaeological record cannot answer. It cannot preserve a pause, a glance, a feeling of unease in the dark. But it is reasonable to suspect that ancient humans were alert to the signs of others: a fresh footprint, a recently used hearth, a broken tool edge, the smell of smoke. These things would matter in a world where strangers could mean danger, opportunity, mating, exchange, or competition. Denisova Cave also forces a reconsideration of culture. Stone tools and ornaments found in and around its deposits show that the region was not culturally empty. Some artifacts are technically impressive, including finely worked objects that have drawn attention because they seem to imply planning, skill, and perhaps symbolic behavior. But the makers are difficult to identify with certainty. A tool style does not carry DNA. A bracelet does not sign its maker's name. No single explanation fully accounts for every association between object, layer, and human group. This uncertainty matters because it prevents an easy story in which one population is automatically advanced and another is merely present. The cave asks for patience. It offers clues, not simple rankings. The deeper lesson is that human worlds overlapped long before history began. In later ages, empires leave roads, borders, inscriptions, and ruins. In the Pleistocene, the traces are thinner, but the underlying reality may be just as complex. Groups expand, retreat, learn, avoid, imitate, and sometimes merge. The Altai becomes one of the few places where that complexity is visible not as speculation, but as layered evidence. Denisovans are there. Neanderthals are there. Modern humans are approaching the broader story. The cave stands between them, silent and indifferent, holding each visit in sediment until the future can recognize the pattern. By the time scientists begin reading the cave's bones and dirt, the old visitors are long gone. But their nearness across time remains startling. A chamber that seems empty has held multiple humanities. A floor that seems still has received footsteps from lineages that once appeared separate in imagination. The cave does not prove that every group met face to face within its walls, but it makes such encounters in the wider region increasingly plausible. It turns the Altai into a frontier not of nations but of humankinds, and beneath that limestone roof, the story of Denisova grows stranger still, because the cave does not merely preserve different humans in sequence, it preserves evidence that their worlds could join. The cave's most astonishing human secret does not come from a complete skeleton resting in ceremonial stillness. It comes, again, from a fragment, a small piece of bone that could easily seem mute beside the grander remains people expect from prehistory. Yet when scientists examine it, the fragment carries an answer so direct that it feels almost impossible at first. This individual is not simply Denisovan. She is not simply Neanderthal. Her genome shows that she had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. making her a first-generation child of two ancient human worlds, in a field where many conclusions are built from probabilities, fragments, and cautious inference. This is unusually intimate evidence. It does not merely suggest that distant human lineages may have mixed somewhere, sometime. It shows that they did. The individual is often known by the specimen name Denisova 11, but behind that label was a young person who lived roughly tens of thousands of years ago, in or near the Altai world that the cave preserves. The bone itself is not visually dramatic. It is a piece of long bone, probably from an arm or leg, belonging to an adolescent. Without DNA, it might have remained one more fragment in a complicated Pleistocene layer, important but not revolutionary. With DNA, it becomes one of the clearest proofs that Neanderthals and Denisovans were not sealed apart by nature, geography, or instinct. They could meet, they could have children, and at least one such child passed through the world close enough to Denisova cave for a piece of her body to enter its long archive. The discovery changes the emotional temperature of the entire story. Interbreeding between ancient humans had already been inferred from genomes. Modern humans outside Africa carry Neanderthal ancestry in varying amounts, and some populations carry Denisovan ancestry as well. But those signals are spread thin across thousands of generations. They are powerful, yet abstract. Denisova 11 is different. She is not a faint trace diluted by time. She is the meeting itself, preserved in one life. Her chromosomes record a family that crosses the categories scientists later created. One parent came from the Neanderthal world, the other from the Denisovan world, and their child stood at the place where those lineages touched. This does not mean such unions were common everywhere. The evidence remains incomplete, and one individual cannot describe the behavior of entire populations across Eurasia. But the fact that a first-generation hybrid appears among so few known Denisovan remains is striking. If interbreeding were extraordinarily rare, finding such a person by chance would seem unlikely, though chance in fossil discovery is always strange. Scholars still debate how frequent these contacts were, whether they occurred during repeated overlap in the Altai, and whether different Denisovan groups mixed with Neanderthals elsewhere. What the evidence strongly suggests is that the boundaries between these humans were porous. They may have been distinct populations, but they were not separate worlds in the absolute sense. Even more revealing is that Denisova 11's father, the Denisovan parent, carried some Neanderthal ancestry from an earlier event. This means the contact between Denisovans and Neanderthals did not begin with this child's parents. Somewhere before her life, perhaps many generations earlier, the two lineages had already met and mixed. The cave gives not a single accident, but a hint of repeated entanglement. The family tree begins to resemble a woven mat, where strands part, cross, and rejoin. The old idea of separate ancient species marching through time along parallel roads becomes harder to maintain. These groups had long, independent histories, but independence did not prevent contact when geography and circumstance brought them together. The human circumstances of such contact remain beyond reach. DNA can show relationship, but it cannot preserve the social meaning of the relationship. It cannot tell whether her parents belonged to neighbouring groups that knew each other, whether one individual had moved between bands, whether the union came through alliance, chance encounter, conflict, adoption, or a pattern of exchange that no longer has a name. The record does not allow a sentimental story, and it does not allow a violent one to be assumed either. What survives in the record suggests biological contact, not the human feelings around it. Still, the existence of the child is enough to remind us that ancient populations were made of people, not diagrams. They had families, however those families were organized. They made choices under pressure. They belonged to groups, but they also crossed boundaries. Denisova 11 also complicates the question of identity. To modern science, she is a hybrid, a term useful for describing ancestry between distinct populations, but she did not live as a scientific category. No one around her would have thought in terms of Neanderthal and Denisovan percentages. Her body simply carried the inheritance of both parents. Perhaps she looked more like one side than the other. Perhaps her features blended traits in ways no one at the time found remarkable. Perhaps the group she lived among accepted such ancestry as ordinary if contact had happened before. Or perhaps she stood out. No evidence can answer this with certainty. The silence is frustrating, but it is also important. It prevents the past from being turned into a neat modern fable. Her life also shows that the Altai was not just a corridor on a map. It was a zone where living populations could actually meet. For Neanderthals and Denisovans to have a child, their ranges had to overlap at least enough for individuals to encounter one another. Climate may have played a role, pushing groups through the same valleys during favourable periods or compressing them into shared refuges during harsher ones. A warmer phase might open routes through forests and foothills. A colder, dry phase might draw hunters toward the same herds and shelters. No single explanation fully accounts for the timing of their contact, but the environment surely shaped the possibilities. In deep prehistory, love, mating, alliance, and conflict all happened within the boundaries set by food, weather, and distance. The discovery also makes Denisova Cave feel less like a storage place of isolated samples and more like a witness to a living frontier. In one layer, a fragment reveals an unknown population. In another, genetic evidence shows Neanderthals. Then this adolescent appears, carrying both. The cave does not give a full community, but it gives enough to show that human evolution was not a simple replacement of one form by another. It was also encounter. It was absorption. It was bloodlines moving through groups that later vanished as separate peoples, but not always without descendants. There is a quiet irony in this. For a long time, ancient human relatives were often imagined through competition. One group must have defeated another. One must have been smarter, stronger, more adaptable. Some competition surely happened, and disappearance is part of the story. But Denisova 11 preserves a different kind of evidence. Her existence does not erase conflict or hardship, yet it proves that contact could also become kinship. The vanished were not only rivals on the edge of our ascent. Sometimes they were parents, sometimes they were children, sometimes the boundary between them passed directly through a single body. In the darkness of Denisova Cave, that truth waits for tens of thousands of years inside a scrap of bone. When it is finally read, the discovery does something rare. It gives the tangled human past a human scale. The great lineages of Eurasia, separated by deep evolutionary time, are suddenly no longer abstract. They meet in one adolescent, one life, one fragile inheritance of mother and father, and through her, the cave says plainly what bones alone had only begun to suggest. The ancient world was more intimate, more complicated, and more connected than anyone had imagined. The deeper the cave's story becomes, the more difficult its objects become to interpret. Bones can sometimes name a body through DNA, but tools do not carry ancestry in the same direct way. A stone flake does not announce whether it was struck by a Denisovan hand, a Neanderthal hand, or a modern human hand. A pendant does not preserve the face of the person who drilled it. A polished bracelet, no matter how beautiful, does not solve the identity of its maker simply by lying in an ancient layer. Denisova Cave is filled with traces of action, but action is not the same as authorship. This is where the mystery becomes more delicate, because the temptation is strong to turn every remarkable object into proof of a remarkable people. The cave refuses to make it that easy. Stone tools are among the most durable witnesses of prehistory. They survive when wood, hide, fibre, and flesh disappear. A sharp edge knocked from a core can lie in sediment for tens of thousands of years, still carrying the angle of a strike, the intention of a hand, the practical logic of cutting meat, scraping hide, shaping bone, or working plant material. In Denisova Cave and the surrounding region, stone artifacts show repeated human activity across long spans of time. Some are simple flakes, some more carefully prepared, some part of broader technological traditions that archaeologists compare across Eurasia. Yet a tool type is not a fingerprint. Different human groups can make similar tools. One group can learn from another. A technology can spread without the large movement of people, and people can move while keeping older habits. The evidence remains incomplete, and the link between artifact and maker must be argued, not assumed. This matters because Denisova Cave has produced objects that seem almost too evocative. Among the finds associated with its deposits are ornaments, worked bone, and the famous stone bracelet fragment made from green chloratolite, polished to a remarkable surface and pierced with a carefully made hole. The object has drawn enormous attention because it suggests patience, planning, skill, and perhaps a concern for appearance or identity beyond simple survival. A bracelet is not necessary in the same way a cutting tool is necessary. It implies display, meaning, memory, status, beauty, or belonging. Though scholars still debate exactly what such objects meant in Ice Age societies, the difficulty is that assigning the bracelet to Denisovans with certainty is not straightforward. Dating, stratigraphy, and association must all be treated carefully. It may come from a context where Denisovans were present, but presence near an object is not the same as a signature. The same caution surrounds other materials. Teeth from Denisova Cave have been especially important because they can preserve genetic information, and because their shapes sometimes hint at unusual anatomy. Large molars linked to Denisovans suggest that at least some individuals had dental features unlike many modern humans. Teeth are tough, compact archives. They form during childhood, record growth, carry wear from diet, and sometimes preserve proteins or DNA long after other bones decay. A tooth can reveal a person's approximate age, developmental stress, ancestry, and habits, yet it too has limits. One tooth cannot build an entire body. A few teeth cannot describe the full variation of a population spread across Asia. What survives in the record suggests difference, but not enough to satisfy the imagination completely. Bone tools add another layer. Worked bone can show a command of materials beyond stone, because bone behaves differently. It can be shaped, smoothed, split, pointed, and polished. It can become an awl, a needle-like implement, a point, or an ornament. In colder environments, where clothing and hide working matter deeply, bone technology can be crucial. A person who can pierce hides, stitch coverings, or fasten layers of skin and fur has a better chance of enduring long winters. But again, the maker may be uncertain. If Denisovans made some of these objects, then their technical abilities were likely more complex than early popular images of unknown archaic humans might suggest. If Neanderthals or modern humans made them, the cave still remains a place of impressive human behavior. Either way, the old habit of ranking ancient people on a crude ladder begins to fail. There is also the problem of time inside the cave. Layers can look orderly in diagrams, but real sediments have histories of disturbance. Animals dig, water moves fine particles. Frost can crack and shift deposits. Later humans can disturb earlier surfaces. A bone from one moment and a tool from another can end up closer together than they originally were. Archaeologists use dating methods, sediment analysis, spatial recording, and comparisons across layers to control these problems. But no cave is a perfect sealed box. No single explanation fully accounts for every object's journey from use to burial to excavation. This uncertainty does not make the site unreliable. It makes it real. The past does not preserve itself for scientific convenience. The question of symbolic behavior often hovers over the cave. Ornaments, pigments, carefully shaped objects, and personal adornment tend to attract modern attention because they seem to speak of imagination. They suggest that ancient humans were not only solving immediate problems, but also marking bodies, relationships, memories, and perhaps beliefs. Yet symbolism is hard to prove from an object alone. A bead may show decoration, but not the story attached to it. A bracelet may show skill, but not whether it belonged to one person, a group tradition, or an exchange network. Scholars still debate how far to push these interpretations, especially when the makers are uncertain. The safest view is also the most interesting. Denisova cave shows that the ancient humans connected to it lived in worlds where technology, movement, and perhaps identity were more intricate than bare survival. The cave's artifacts also remind us that culture is not preserved evenly. Stone survives, but baskets vanish. Bone may survive, but sinew bindings decay. A wooden spear, a woven cord, a skin bag, a painted hide, a child's toy, a song, a route taught by memory. Almost all of this disappears. The surviving record is biased toward the hard and the lucky. Denisovans may have had traditions that left almost no trace. Neanderthals did too. Modern humans certainly did. To judge these people only by what endures in stone is like judging a vanished library by its door hinges. The objects are invaluable, but they are only fragments of a much larger life. So Denisova Cave becomes a place of disciplined imagination. The artifacts invite wonder, but they also demand restraint. A polished bracelet in the earth, a large tooth in a tray, a worked bone point, a stone flake with a clean edge. Each one adds texture to the human presence in the cave. None of them alone can solve the full identity of the makers. Together, they reveal a landscape where multiple human groups use skill, memory, and adaptation to survive. The mystery is not whether these ancient people were capable. The mystery is how their abilities, contacts, and traditions overlapped in ways the surviving evidence can only partially recover. In the dim chamber of Denisova, every object seems to say two things at once: someone was here, and much of who they were is still missing. Once Denisovans are found in a Siberian cave, the first instinct is to anchor them there. The name itself encourages it. Denisova sounds local, tied to one limestone chamber in the Altai, one valley, one cold mountain region, where bone and DNA survived by a rare combination of climate, chance, and careful excavation. But the genetic evidence refuses to stay in Siberia. It begins to appear far away, scattered through living people and ancient genomes like faint smoke from a fire whose hearth has not yet been found. The cave gives the world a name for them, but it does not contain their story. It is only the place where the hidden population first becomes visible. The traces lead east and south, into a human map much wider than the Altai. Denisovan ancestry appears in varying amounts among many populations across Asia, and it becomes especially striking in parts of Oceania, including Melanesia and indigenous peoples of New Guinea and nearby islands. This is one of the great surprises of the discovery. The only early Denisovan fossils are found in Siberia, yet some of the strongest Denisovan genetic inheritance is found thousands of miles away. Among people whose ancestors travelled through Southeast Asia and into the island worlds beyond, the distance is enormous. The implication is simple but unsettling. Denisovans, or closely related Denisovan populations, must once have ranged across a far broader area than their sparse bones suggest. This does not mean a single Denisovan group walked from the Altai to New Guinea in one clear journey. The evidence remains incomplete, and the map is almost certainly more complicated. Genetic studies suggest that Denisovans were not one uniform population. They may have been divided into deeply separated groups across Asia, perhaps adapted to different environments and separated by distance for long periods. The Denisovans of the Altai may have been only one northern branch. Others may have lived farther south, in forests, river valleys, coastal corridors, island-edge landscapes, or regions where heat and humidity destroyed bones before they could reach modern science. In warm climates, DNA decays quickly, and fossils are less likely to preserve the fragile molecular clues that made Denisova Cave famous. Whole populations can vanish from the visible record simply because the ground they lived on was unkind to preservation. That is why the Denisovan story becomes a story of ghosts, not because it belongs to fantasy, but because much of it is known by absence. Scientists see the imprint in living genomes, but the bodies are mostly missing. They can detect ancient mixture, but not always identify the place where it happened. They can estimate that ancestors of some modern humans interbred with Denisovan-related groups, but the exact roots, times, and social settings remain debated. Somewhere in the long movement of Homo sapiens through Asia, modern humans encountered Denisovan populations. Some encounters left descendants. Those descendants carried small pieces of Denisovan ancestry onward through migrations, bottlenecks, island crossings, and generations of survival. The geography is difficult to imagine because the world was different. Sea levels were often lower during Ice Age periods, exposing land that is now underwater. Southeast Asia included a vast landmass called Sunda, connecting areas that are now separated by sea, including parts of mainland Southeast Asia and the islands of Borneo, Java, and Sumatra. Farther east lay Sahel, the combined Pleistocene landmass of Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. Between them were island chains and sea crossings that still required skill, planning, and risk. Modern humans moving into these regions were not wandering blindly. They followed coastlines, rivers, animals, plants, seasonal knowledge, and social memory. Somewhere along these pathways, Denisovan inheritance entered their story. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Some Denisovan ancestry may come from one major episode of mixture. Some may come from repeated contacts with different Denisovan-related groups. Some populations carry more because their ancestors passed through regions where Denisovans were present. Others carry less because of later population movements, dilution, or simple demographic chance. The genetic record is not a clean trail of footprints. It is more like a river system, with old streams joining, splitting, drying, and resurfacing far downstream. By the time Denisovan ancestry is visible in living people, the original encounters have been folded into tens of thousands of years of human movement. What makes this especially powerful is that the fossil record alone would never have predicted it. Without DNA, Denisovans might have remained a Siberian oddity, a local archaic population known from a few bones and teeth. Instead, genetics shows that they were part of the ancestry of people living far beyond Siberia. This does not make modern Melanesians or other groups Denisovan in any simple sense, any more than Neanderthal ancestry makes many non-African people Neanderthal. The contribution is partial, layered within overwhelmingly modern human ancestry, but it matters because it proves contact, and because some inherited Denisovan variants may have influenced adaptation in later human populations. The deeper implication is that Asia was once filled with human diversity that archaeology has only begun to recover. Europe, with its long history of excavation and better preservation in many regions, gave scientists Neanderthals in enough detail to become familiar. Asia, much larger and ecologically more varied, likely held a more complex human picture. Forests, mountains, deserts, plateaus, coasts, and islands could have sheltered populations whose fossils remain undiscovered or unrecognized. The Denisovan signal hints at these lost worlds. It suggests ancient humans did not move through Asia as a single wave meeting only empty land. They entered a continent already inhabited by relatives with their own deep histories. There is a humility in this. For much of modern history, prehistory was reconstructed from what was found first and preserved best. That created an accidental bias. Europe seemed central partly because European evidence was abundant, studied early, and preserved in ways science could use. Denisovan ancestry spreading across Asia and Oceania shifts the center of gravity. It reminds us that the most important parts of human evolution may have happened in places where bones decay. Shorelines drowned, caves remain unexplored, or fragments wait unnoticed in museum collections. Scholars still debate the full Denisovan range, but the genetic evidence has already made one thing clear: the missing map is enormous. The cave in the Altai therefore becomes a doorway rather than a destination. Through it, scientists glimpse not only one vanished population, but a wider world of contact stretching across the eastern half of Eurasia and into the Pacific edge of human migration. The people first named in a Siberian cave may have had cousins under tropical canopies, near ancient rivers, on routes toward drowned coastlines, and perhaps in mountain regions where cold air thinned the breath. Their bones are mostly gone. Their tools, if found, may not yet be recognized as theirs. Their languages vanished without echo, but their ancestry travelled on in living bodies, quiet and persistent, carrying news from human worlds that disappeared before anyone knew they existed. Far from the Altai, where Denisova Cave opens into its cold Siberian valley, another landscape rises so high that the air itself becomes a test. The Tibetan Plateau is often called the roof of the world, but that phrase can make it sound still and distant, as if height alone defines it. In reality, it is a place of severe pressure on the body. The sky seems larger there, the horizon wider, the light sharper, and the thin air carries less oxygen with every breath. For animals and humans alike, life at such altitude is not simply uncomfortable. It is a biological challenge repeated with every heartbeat, every pregnancy, every night of sleep, every load carried across a slope, every child trying to grow where the body receives less of what it needs. Modern people living on the Tibetan Plateau are adapted to this world in ways that are not merely cultural. Clothing, shelter, herding knowledge, trade routes, and food traditions all matter, but the body matters too. At high altitude, many lowland humans respond by producing more red blood cells, trying to carry oxygen more efficiently. That can help for short periods, but too much thickened blood can strain the heart and create serious health risks. Tibetan populations often show a different pattern, maintaining relatively lower hemoglobin levels compared with many newcomers at similar elevations, while still living and working effectively in the thin air. This is one of the most striking examples of human adaptation, and for a long time it seemed to belong entirely to the story of modern humans adjusting to an extreme environment over thousands of years. Then Denisovan ancestry enters the picture like a message from a vanished mountain road. A genetic variant associated with high-altitude adaptation, especially in the region of a gene called EPAS. One appears to have come into the ancestors of Tibetans through ancient interbreeding with Denisovan-related humans. The detail is technical, but the meaning is profound. A group that no longer exists as a separate people may have contributed to the survival of later humans in one of the harshest inhabited landscapes on Earth. The Denisovans did not simply vanish into museum drawers and cave sediments. Part of their inheritance may still be helping living people breathe in high places. This does not mean Denisovans were Tibetan in any modern sense, and it does not mean all high-altitude adaptation comes from one source. Culture, environment, selection, and population history all interact over long periods. Scholars still debate the exact route by which the Denisovan-like variant entered the ancestors of Tibetan populations, where the interbreeding happened and which Denisovan population carried it. The evidence remains incomplete. Because the Denisovans known from the Altai may not be the same Denisovan-related people who lived nearer the plateau or in regions now poorly represented by fossils. But the genetic signal is strong enough to change the story. It suggests that ancient mixture was not just an accidental trace of contact. Sometimes, it gave later humans tools of survival written inside the body. The Tibetan Plateau connection also gives Denisovans a landscape beyond the cave. For years, they were imagined through Siberian cold, cave floors, and fragmented bones. The plateau widens that image. It suggests Denisovan-related humans, or at least their close relatives, may have moved through high and difficult terrain long before modern populations became established there. A jawbone found on the Tibetan Plateau, identified as Denisovan-related through protein evidence, strengthens the sense that these people were not confined to low valleys or northern caves, They could survive in places where the air thins and the body is forced to adapt. What survives in the record suggests range, flexibility, and endurance, though the details remain scattered. The idea is quietly astonishing. Somewhere in the deep past, perhaps on a plateau edge, perhaps in a valley route leading upward, perhaps far from the precise place where the genetic inheritance later became important, modern humans and Denisovan-related people met. The encounter did not need to be grand. It may have involved small groups whose names, languages, and histories are gone beyond recovery. Yet from such contact came descendants. And among the inherited fragments carried forward was a variant that natural selection later favoured in high-altitude environments. In lowlands, it might have been just another piece of ancient ancestry. In Tibet, it became useful. The mountain turned inheritance into advantage. This is one of the lesser-known ways evolution works. Adaptation is not always built from brand new mutations appearing at the perfect moment. Sometimes it draws from variation already present in a population. Sometimes it borrows from ancient mixture. A genetic variant can wait in the background until people enter an environment where it suddenly matters. The world changes the value of what the body already carries. For the ancestors of Tibetans, the plateau created a test, and a Denisovan-derived inheritance may have helped answer it. No single explanation fully accounts for the success of human life at altitude, but this inheritance is one of the clearest examples of how vanished humans contributed to modern adaptation. There is deep irony in this. Denisovans themselves disappeared as a distinct group, at least as far as current evidence shows. Their bones are rare, their faces remain uncertain, their tools are difficult to assign, their languages are lost without a trace. Yet one of their legacies may be felt in breath itself, not in a monument, not in writing, not in a myth that can be traced to them, but in the quiet efficiency of bodies living under a high sky. The vanished survive not as memory, but as function. The mountain gift also changes the emotional meaning of interbreeding. It is easy to think of ancient admixture as a curiosity, a percentage in a genome report, a footnote to the larger story of modern humans spreading across the world. But in Tibet, the Denisovan connection becomes more concrete. It shows that contact between human groups could shape real survival. A fragment of ancestry could affect how people endured cold nights, thin air, childbirth, work, and migration. The ancient encounter did not just leave a signature for scientists to detect, it may have helped make a difficult homeland livable. And so the cave and the plateau become linked across distance. In Siberia, a small bone reveals an unknown people. In Tibet, a genetic inheritance suggests that those people, or their close relatives, left something behind that later humans carried into the heights. Between the two lies a missing map of movements, meetings, and vanished communities. The path is broken. The evidence is incomplete, but the outline is powerful enough to see. Denisovans were not merely another extinct human group. They were part of the living machinery of human survival, their legacy rising far beyond the cave, into the mountains, into the breath of people who still live beneath the enormous sky. The gift carried into the mountains makes the Denisovan discovery larger than a single extinct population. It opens a wider door onto a world where humanity was never alone in the simple way people once imagined. The old human story often moved towards solitude, as if every earlier form stood behind us on a road that narrowed until only Homo sapiens remained. That ending is true in one sense. Today, there is only one surviving human species. But Denisova Cave makes the path toward that ending look far more crowded, far more tangled, and far less inevitable. For much of the Ice Age, the planet did not hold one kind of human waiting to inherit everything. It held several, moving through different landscapes, adapting in different ways, sometimes avoiding one another, sometimes meeting, and sometimes becoming part of one another's descendants. This is the deeper change Denisova brings. Neanderthals were already enough to disturb the idea of human uniqueness, because they were close relatives with intelligence, tools, fire, social care, and long endurance in difficult environments. But Neanderthals had become familiar. They had a place in the public imagination. Denisovans arrived differently. They appeared almost without a body, then spread outward through DNA, high-altitude adaptation, hybrid ancestry, and ghostly traces across Asia and Oceania. Their discovery suggested that if one unknown human population could hide in plain sight until a tiny bone was sequenced, then the ancient world may have contained other missing lineages still waiting to be recognized. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness has become one of the most important facts in the field. A more crowded world does not mean a world packed with people. Ice Age population numbers were small by modern standards. Vast regions might have held only scattered bands, each moving through enormous territories, each relying on memory, skill, and cooperation. Crowded means something different here. It means evolutionary crowdedness, a landscape of related human forms whose ranges could overlap across tens of thousands of years. A valley might be empty for generations, then used by Neanderthals, then Denisovans, then modern humans, or by groups whose identities are still uncertain. A river corridor could carry tools, genes, habits, and stories across distances no map of species boundaries can easily show. Humankinds were not arranged like pieces in separate boxes. They lived in a world of shifting edges. The idea of replacement becomes less clean under this light. Modern humans did expand widely, and eventually became the only surviving humans. But their success was not the simple advance of a lone species through an empty stage. They inherited landscapes shaped by older humans. They encountered relatives who had already solved local problems of cold, altitude, food, stone, and movement. In some places, modern humans may have outcompeted them. In others, climate change may have weakened small populations before contact ever mattered. In still others, ancient groups may not have vanished suddenly but been absorbed, their distinct identity dissolving into larger modern human populations. No single explanation fully accounts for this process across all regions. Extinction, in the human family, was sometimes disappearance and sometimes transformation. Denisova also changes the meaning of intelligence in prehistory. For too long, there was a habit of treating Homo sapiens as the only truly creative actor, while other human relatives were judged by how closely they seemed to resemble us. That view has weakened with every serious look at Neanderthal behavior, and Denisovans make it weaker still. If Denisovan-related people survived across huge distances, contributed useful genetic adaptations, and possibly made or shared complex technologies, then they cannot be reduced to shadows beside the modern human rise. The record does not allow easy claims about their art, language, or symbolic life. But what survives suggests capable human beings shaped by their own histories. The absence of evidence for certain behaviors is not proof that those behaviors never existed. This crowded world also forces a different view of migration. Human movement was not a single heroic march outward. It was a long series of expansions, failures, retreats, and returns. Some groups disappeared in climates that turned against them. Some survived in refuges. Some followed herds across exposed plains. Some moved along coasts now drowned by rising seas. Some climbed into mountains or crossed island chains. Along the way, they carried more than bodies. They carried stoneworking traditions, ways of reading animals, knowledge of plants, rules of kinship, and perhaps songs or stories no archaeology can recover. When groups met, the result could be danger, imitation, exchange, avoidance, or interbreeding. The archaeological record preserves only the hardest pieces of these encounters, but genetics reveals that some meetings became ancestry. The surprising detail is that this crowdedness may have been normal. To modern humans, being alone as the last human species feels natural because it is the only condition ever experienced in recorded history. But for most of the deeper past, solitude may have been the exception. Earlier humans lived alongside other human forms for long stretches. A Homo sapiens band entering parts of Eurasia may have been entering a world where the category human had more than one face. They may have seen people who were different in body, perhaps in voice, gesture, clothing, and tools, yet close enough to recognize as people in some practical sense. Scholars still debate how these encounters were understood by the groups themselves, because the evidence cannot preserve ancient categories of identity. But biology shows that the boundary was not absolute. That recognition makes the present feel stranger. Every modern human belongs to one surviving species, yet many carry traces of vanished relatives. Neanderthal ancestry is found in many people outside Africa. Denisovan ancestry appears in uneven patterns across Asia and Oceania. Other ghost populations may have contributed to African and Eurasian ancestry in ways still being studied. The living body becomes a record of meetings that happened before writing, before agriculture, before cities, before any remembered kingdom. Human identity is not purified by time, it is layered by it. Dennis of a cave therefore does more than add a missing cousin. It changes the atmosphere of prehistory. The old emptiness fills with movement. The silence gains overlapping footsteps. A cave in Siberia, a jaw on a high plateau, traces in island populations, fragments in ancient genomes, all begin to form a picture of Earth as a place once shared by multiple human lineages. They were not monsters, not myths, not failed drafts waiting for us to appear. They were human relatives with their own long struggles against cold, hunger, distance, and chance. Some disappeared, some were absorbed, some remain only as faint inheritance. And once that is understood, the rise of Homo sapiens no longer looks like a straight line of triumph. It looks like the last visible strand of a much wider human web, woven from lives that mostly vanished before history learned how to remember them. If Dennis of a cave reveals a world crowded with human relatives, it also leaves behind the hardest questions such a world can ask. Where did they go? Denisovans were real enough to leave DNA in bone, traces in sediment, ancestry in living people, and perhaps adaptations that still help some humans breathe in the high air of Tibet. Yet they're gone as a distinct population. No Denisovan villages remain. No unbroken Denisovan community survives. No language, burial tradition, story cycle. Or self-name reaches the present. They step into scientific view already vanished, like figures seen only by the shadows they cast after the fire has gone out. The discovery proves they existed, but it does not explain their disappearance. Extinction is often imagined as a single dramatic event, a final winter, a killing blow, a last refuge emptied by catastrophe. Sometimes nature does work that way. A volcanic eruption, a sudden climate shock, a flood, a drought, or the collapse of prey populations can break a fragile group quickly. But for Denisovans, no such simple ending has been found. The evidence remains incomplete, and the surviving traces are too scattered to point toward one final scene. Their disappearance was probably not one moment, not one battlefield, not one frozen valley where the last of them fell. It may have been a long fading different in different regions, with some groups shrinking, some moving, some mixing with modern humans, and some simply leaving no recoverable evidence after their last generations passed. Climate is one possible pressure, because the Pleistocene world was never stable for long. The environments Denisovans knew changed again and again. Cold phases opened steppe landscapes and pushed forests back. Warmer phases altered animal ranges and vegetation. Glacial cycles could turn familiar territories into harsher places or make old routes unusable. Small populations are especially vulnerable to such shifts. A band can survive ordinary hardship through skill and cooperation. But if herds move away, plant resources change, winters lengthen, or neighbouring groups are also under pressure, survival becomes more uncertain. What survives in the record suggests that Denisovans endured across long stretches of time, so they were not fragile in any simple sense. Still, Endurance is not immunity. A population can survive many crises and fail under the next combination of pressures. Competition may also have mattered. Modern humans expanding through Eurasia and beyond were highly adaptable, socially connected, and capable of rapid movement across different environments. They carried flexible tool traditions, long-distance networks in some regions, and eventually symbolic systems visible in ornaments, art, and complex social behavior. But it would be too easy to turn this into a crude story of superior humans sweeping aside inferior relatives. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not helpless obstacles. They had survived for immense periods before widespread modern human expansion. The question is not whether modern humans were simply better, but whether even small advantages in population size, exchange networks, mobility, childbirth survival, technology, or social cooperation could accumulate over generations. No single explanation fully accounts for why one human lineage remained and others did not. Absorption may be the most quietly powerful answer. Denisovans may not have disappeared everywhere by being destroyed. Some may have been folded into expanding modern human populations through interbreeding. Their distinct communities could fade while parts of their ancestry continued. This is extinction by merging, a process less dramatic than slaughter and harder to see in archaeology. If a small Denisovan group joined, exchanged mates with, or was gradually incorporated into a larger Homo sapiens population, their separate identity could vanish in a few generations, even while their genes survived. This may have happened more than once, in different parts of Asia. The Denisovan legacy in modern genomes hints at such encounters, but DNA cannot tell whether they were peaceful, tense, accidental, or repeated through long relationships between neighbouring groups. There is also the problem of numbers. Ancient human populations were often small and scattered. Small populations can vanish through forces that leave no obvious archaeological signature. A few bad seasons, disease, low birth rates, accidents, conflict, or the loss of key elders can matter deeply when there are not many people. Isolation can reduce genetic diversity and make groups more vulnerable. If Denisovan populations were spread thinly across varied environments, some branches may have been resilient for a long time while others disappeared quietly. Scholars still debate how many Denisovan populations existed and how different they were from one another. The answer matters, because there may not have been one Denisovan disappearance. There may have been many endings. The fossil record makes this question even more difficult. Denisovans are known from so few physical remains that their final centuries or millennia are almost invisible. In warm and wet regions, their bones may have decayed. Along ancient coastlines, sites may now lie under the sea. In forests, organic materials vanish quickly. In caves not yet excavated, fragments may still wait in layers no one has reached. Some fossils already found may belong to Denisovan-related populations, but remain unrecognized because they lack DNA or clear diagnostic features. The silence may not mean absence. It may mean the evidence has not survived, or has not yet been understood. This is why the disappearance of Denisovans feels different from the collapse of a city or empire. There are no burned gates, no abandoned temples, no royal inscriptions suddenly ending. Their world predates those kinds of records. Their disappearance is written in thinning signals, missing bones, and traces diluted into other populations. It is a vanishing at the edge of visibility. The more science learns, the more the ending becomes less like a closed door and more like mist moving through trees. Some Denisovan lineages may have died out completely. Some may have been absorbed by modern humans. Some may have lingered longer than current evidence can prove. The record does not yet allow a final date. Yet their disappearance changed the world simply by leaving Homo sapiens alone. Whether by climate, competition, absorption, chance, or all of these together, the ancient human crowd narrowed, Neanderthals vanished, Denisovans vanished. Other possible relatives vanished or remain unnamed. The result is the strange solitude of the present, a planet filled with billions of humans who all belong to one surviving species, while carrying within some of their bodies the fragments of those who did not remain separate. Denisovans lost their independent future, but not every part of them was erased. Their ending was not total darkness. It was a fading into bone, sediment, and inheritance. And in that fading, they left one of the most haunting lessons of prehistory disappearance does not always mean complete absence. Sometimes it means becoming hidden inside the survivors. The deeper Denisova cave is studied, the more its silence changes character. At first, the cave seems to speak through the familiar remains of archaeology bone, tooth, stone, ash, and worked objects lifted carefully from the floor. But then science learns to listen to something even less visible. The sediment itself begins to matter. Dirt, once treated mainly as the material surrounding the evidence, becomes evidence in its own right. A handful of cave soil can contain microscopic traces of ancient life, fragments of genetic material shed by bodies that no longer survive as bones, skin cells, blood, hair, waste, decaying tissue, and the dust of living presence can settle into the ground and remain there long after the person has disappeared. In a place like Denisova, the floor is not merely a surface people walked across. It is an archive made from everything they left without knowing. This is one of the great quiet revolutions in modern archaeology. For a long time, human presence depended heavily on visible remains. If there was no bone, no tooth, no clear tool, then the people themselves could remain uncertain. A layer might suggest occupation because of hearths or artifacts, but identifying exactly which human group had been there was much harder. Ancient DNA from bones changed that, but bones are rare. Most people do not fossilize. Most skeletons are destroyed before they can become part of the record. Sediment DNA pushes beyond that limit. It raises the possibility that a human group can be detected even when not a single visible piece of that group's body is found in the layer. The method is powerful, but it demands caution. Ancient DNA in sediment is fragile, fragmented, and vulnerable to contamination. A cave is not a sealed laboratory. Water moves through deposits. Animals dig. Later people disturb earlier surfaces. DNA can shift in tiny particles, and modern human contamination is always a danger. Researchers must use careful sampling, clean procedures, controls, and comparisons to separate ancient signals from noise. The evidence remains incomplete, and sediment DNA does not replace traditional archaeology. It adds another voice, one that must be checked against dating, stratigraphy, climate evidence, artifacts, and bones when they exist. Used carefully, though, it can reveal presence where absence once seemed absolute. In Denisova Cave, sediment DNA helps transform the site from a collection of remarkable finds into a long sequence of human occupation and replacement. Layers can be tested for traces of Denisovan, Neanderthal, and modern human DNA, allowing researchers to see patterns through time with a new kind of resolution. The cave begins to show not only that different humans were present, but that their presence shifted across changing climates and periods. A layer may carry Denisovan genetic traces. Another may carry Neanderthal traces. Some may suggest overlap, transition, or return. The cave floor becomes less like a stack of mute dirt and more like a damaged, partial, but astonishingly intimate record of who passed through the chamber. This matters because it reduces dependence on spectacular fossils. A famous finger bone can open the story, but the cave cannot be understood through one fossil alone. Sediment DNA gives the broader pattern, showing that the Denisovan presence was not a single accident. It also helps reveal Neanderthal activity in the same place across time. What survives in the record suggests repeated use by different human populations, not one clean occupation. The cave becomes a place where lineages appear, vanish, and sometimes return, shaped by climate and opportunity. It does not tell us whether one group pushed another away, whether they avoided the cave in certain periods, or whether environmental change altered the usefulness of the valley. But it gives enough to see that human presence in the Altai was dynamic. The technique also changes the emotional scale of the site. There is something almost uncanny about finding a person without a bone. A human body passes through a cave tens of thousands of years ago. That person breathes, sweats, sheds cells, perhaps sleeps near a wall, perhaps cuts meat beside a fire, perhaps leaves nothing that the eye can recognize. No tool can be confidently tied to that individual. No skeleton remains. Yet microscopic traces settle into the ground. And after immense stretches of time, science detects the lineage. It is not a portrait, it is not a name, but it is presence. The dead become visible through the smallest possible residue of having lived. Sediment also reminds researchers that caves are shared spaces in more than a human sense. Animal DNA can appear alongside human DNA, helping reconstruct environments and the creatures that move through them. Hyenas, bears, ungulates, small mammals, and other species are part of the cave's record. Their presence helps build a picture of climate and ecology, because animals respond to changing landscapes. A layer rich in certain species may suggest colder, more open conditions. Another may reflect different environmental patterns. Human groups did not live apart from this world. Their movements were tied to animals, plants, water, weather, and shelter. Sediment DNA, therefore, does not merely ask who was there. It asks what kind of world they entered. The lesser-known surprise is that dirt can sometimes preserve a clearer human signal than the visible record suggests. A layer without human bones may still hold human DNA. A layer with tools but no identifiable maker may offer genetic clues. In some cases, sediment can complicate assumptions, showing that the presence of artifacts and the presence of a specific human lineage do not always align neatly. Scholars still debate how to interpret difficult layers, especially where dating or disturbance complicates the story. But the direction is clear. Archaeology is no longer limited to what hands can pick up. It is learning to read the invisible residue around the objects. This does not make the mystery smaller. In some ways, it makes it larger. If Denisova Cave can reveal lost humans through soil, then countless other sites may hold similar signals waiting to be recovered. Caves across Asia, Europe, and beyond may contain DNA from populations whose bones never survived. Museum sediments, old excavation samples, and newly protected sites may become archives of vanished movement. The human map may change again, not because someone finds a skull, but because a layer of earth yields a genetic whisper. No single explanation fully accounts for the human past when the evidence itself keeps changing form. By the time sediment DNA joins the story, Denisova Cave has become something more than a place of discovery. It becomes a demonstration of how the past hides. It hides in fragments, in teeth, in broken tools, in layers disturbed by animals and frost, and now in the dirt itself. The cave teaches that absence is often only a failure of detection. The people who moved through the Altai did not know they were leaving their signatures in the floor. They did not know that the dust beneath their feet could outlast their bodies, their groups, their languages, and their remembered world. Yet the cave kept those traces, patient and cold, until science became sensitive enough to hear them. By the time Denisova Cave gives up bone, tooth, hybrid ancestry, sediment DNA, and traces carried into living bodies, the map of human origins no longer looks the way it once did. It is not simply that one more ancient population has been added to the chart. A chart can absorb a new name easily. The deeper change is that the chart itself becomes suspect. Lines that once looked separate now have to bend toward one another. Regions once treated as empty corridors become inhabited landscapes. The clean border between extinction and ancestry begins to blur. Denisova forces anthropology to accept a more difficult truth. The human past is not a procession of isolated species replacing one another in order, but a long, uneven field of populations, contacts, disappearances, and inheritances. This is a major shift because maps shape imagination. When prehistory is drawn as a simple route out of Africa, across Eurasia, and into the rest of the world, the eye follows the arrows and misses the lives already present along the way. Modern humans did leave Africa and expand widely, but they did not move through a silent planet. They moved through territories where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other unnamed relatives had already adapted to local worlds. Some of these relatives had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew cold valleys, high plateaus, dry grasslands, forests, rivers, and seasonal animal routes. The newcomers were not entering a blank stage. They were entering a human world that was older than their arrival. The Denisovan discovery widens Asia in particular. For a long time, the public story of ancient humans leaned heavily on Europe, partly because Neanderthal fossils were found there early and in great number, and partly because European cave art captured imagination. Asia was often present as a route, a vast space crossed on the way to Australia, the Pacific, or the Americas. Denisovans make that view impossible to keep. Asia becomes not a corridor, but a centre of deep human diversity. The Altai, the Tibetan Plateau, Southeast Asian routes, and the island edge worlds of Oceania all become part of a larger and still unfinished human map. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is already enough to show that some of the most important chapters of human evolution may have unfolded where preservation is poor, excavation is difficult, or the right methods have only recently arrived. This also changes how scholars think about migration. Movement is no longer just the spread of one population into empty space. It becomes interaction. A migrating group may carry its own ancestry, meet another group, exchange genes, absorb local adaptations, and continue onward altered by the encounter. Later generations may remember nothing of the meeting, especially across tens of thousands of years. But the body keeps a partial record. Denisovan ancestry in modern populations, Neanderthal ancestry across much of the world outside Africa, and hints of other ghost populations all show that migration was not only movement through land, it was movement through other human histories. The idea of ancestry becomes less pure and more interesting. Modern identity often looks backward for clean origins: one people, one homeland, one line of descent. Deep history does not cooperate. It shows mixture, survival, loss, and renewal. A person living today may carry genetic fragments from ancient humans who looked different, lived differently, and vanished as separate populations before agriculture began. These fragments are small, unevenly distributed, and often scientifically complex. So they should not be turned into simplistic claims about superiority, authenticity, or identity. But they matter. They show that humanity's inheritance is layered. The living are not the result of a single untouched stream, but of many currents, some visible, some hidden beneath the surface. Denisova also changes the old question of what counts as human. This question has always been dangerous when treated carelessly, because it can turn scientific categories into moral rankings. The Denisovan evidence pushes against that habit. Denisovans were not modern humans, yet they were close relatives. They were distinct from Neanderthals, yet connected to them. They were separate enough to be named, yet close enough to have children with both Neanderthals and ancestors of some modern humans. If humanity is imagined only as Homo sapiens, then Denisovans sit outside it. If humanity is understood more broadly as a family of intelligent, adaptable, socially living hominins, then they belong close to us. Scholars still debate terminology, but the moral lesson is clear enough: difference in the ancient human family does not mean distance from significance. This matters because the old ladder of progress has done lasting damage to how people imagine prehistory. The ladder places one form beneath another, as if evolution were climbing toward us with steady intention. Denisova breaks the ladder. It shows branches that survive for long periods, meet other branches, contribute to later populations, and vanish in ways that are not simply failure. Denisovans did not endure to the present as a distinct people, but part of their inheritance did. Neanderthals disappeared too, yet many living humans carry Neanderthal DNA. Extinction, in this sense, is not always a full stop. Sometimes it is a change of form, a disappearance of community while fragments continue inside others. The discovery also reshapes the practice of archaeology itself. A site can no longer be judged only by dramatic bones or beautiful artifacts. A tiny fragment can reveal a population. Sediment can identify visitors. Proteins in a jaw can link a fossil to a lineage when DNA no longer survives. Museum collections can become newly important as older finds are re-examined with newer methods. The past is not only under the ground, it is also inside drawers, labels, samples, and overlooked pieces waiting for a question that earlier generations did not know how to ask. What survives in the record suggests that many future discoveries may not look spectacular at first. They may look like dust, chips, teeth, or broken fragments. Yet the new human map is not complete, and that is part of its importance. Denisova Cave does not solve human origins. It makes the mystery more honest. It shows that many confident older maps were built from partial evidence, and that the missing evidence was not empty space. Somewhere beyond the current record are populations not yet named, routes not yet traced, encounters not yet understood, and endings not yet visible. No single explanation fully accounts for how one surviving human species emerged from such a crowded past. Climate, culture, migration, chance, population size, adaptation, and contact all played roles, and their balance likely differed from region to region. The result is a humbler, stranger, and more powerful view of ourselves. Modern humans are not less remarkable because the story is tangled. If anything, the tangled story makes survival more remarkable. It means the present is the outcome of countless fragile passages through danger, movement, meeting, and loss. Denisova Cave does not reduce humanity to genetics. It restores depth to the word human. It asks us to imagine a world where the face in the firelight might not be exactly ours, but not entirely other either. A world where kinship could cross lines later drawn by science. A world where the last surviving humans still carry, in quiet molecular form, the memory of those who disappeared. The cave still keeps more than it gives. That is the final lesson of Denisova, and perhaps the most important one. After all the sequencing, the careful excavation, the tooth measurements, the sediment samples, the debates over tools and layers, the site remains partly unreadable. It has already changed the human story, yet it has not finished speaking. Its floor is not an open book so much as a book burned at the edges, soaked by time, scattered by animals, and written in several languages at once. Scientists can recover phrases, they can compare fragments, they can sometimes reconstruct the shape of a missing sentence, but much of the meaning remains buried, damaged, or absent, and the cave's silence is not empty. It is dense with things that only survived. Denisova Cave reminds us that some discoveries do not end a mystery. They make the mystery more precise. Before the finger bone, the missing human population had no name. After the DNA, the name Denisovan gave shape to the unknown, but it also raised questions that reached far beyond the Altai. Where were they born as a lineage? How many Denisovan populations existed? What did most of them look like? How far did they travel? Did they live in forests, coastlands, deserts, and islands as well as caves and mountains? What languages or gestures bound their groups together? Did they make ornaments in the cave? Or did those objects belong to other hands moving through the same layers? Scholars still debate these questions because the evidence remains incomplete, and in some cases the missing evidence may never return. There is a particular kind of humility in standing before a cave that has preserved enough to overturn old ideas, but not enough to satisfy the hunger for a full story. Modern science can sequence molecules from a splinter of bone, detect human DNA in dirt, and trace inheritance across continents. Yet it still cannot tell us what a Denisovan mother taught her child, how a group chose a campsite, what they feared at night, or what sounds passed between them around fire. The most advanced methods reach their limit at the edge of lived experience. What survives in the record suggests bodies, kinship, movement, adaptation, and contact. It does not preserve memory in the human sense. It gives ancestry without autobiography. The cave's remaining questions are not small. More fossils may still lie in its deposits or in nearby sites. A more complete Denisovan skull, if ever found and securely identified, would transform understanding of their appearance. More ancient genomes could reveal whether the Altai Denisovans were unusual or typical within their wider family. Sediment DNA from other caves across Asia could show Denisovan movements in regions where bones are absent. Old museum collections may contain fragments already excavated but not yet recognized. A tooth in a drawer, a jaw labelled uncertain, a small bone once considered unremarkable. Any of these might become the next key. Denisova has taught researchers to distrust the ordinary appearance of fragments. Yet every future discovery will come with the same warning. Evidence must be placed carefully within time and place. A bone without context can mislead. A beautiful artifact can be claimed too eagerly. A genetic signal can be overread if it is forced into a simple story. The cave has changed everything not because it encourages wild speculation, but because it rewards discipline. It shows that the most astonishing conclusions can come from cautious work, a fragment measured, a sample protected from contamination, a layer dated, a genome compared, a result tested until the unlikely becomes undeniable. The mystery is powerful because it is grounded. It does not need unsupported legends. The real evidence is strange enough. Denisova also keeps the mystery of ordinary lives. It is easy to focus on the spectacular, the unknown lineage, the hybrid child, the mountain adaptation, the genetic inheritance stretching toward Oceania. But the cave's deepest record is made of repeated small acts. Someone carries stone to a protected place. Someone cuts meat. Someone tends fire while cold gathers outside. Someone loses a tooth, sheds a cell, breaks a bone, leaves ash, leaves nothing visible at all. These acts are not dramatic in isolation. Yet together they build the only surviving bridge to vanished people. The cave is not a monument to kings or conquest. It is a monument to survival without monument, to lives that did not know they were becoming evidence. And because the cave still keeps so much hidden, it continues to widen the imagination. Perhaps Denisovans once stood at the edge of tropical forests, where their bones dissolved in warm soil. Perhaps they watched animals move across grasslands now buried beneath farms and cities. Perhaps some reached coastlines drowned by rising seas after the Ice Age. Perhaps their descendants, absorbed into modern human groups, carried fragments of stories that changed beyond recognition and eventually disappeared. No single explanation fully accounts for the distances suggested by their DNA or the rarity of their bones. The gap between genetic range and fossil evidence remains one of the great open spaces in the story. The cave itself does not care about these questions. It continues to weather the seasons. Snow gathers above it. Meltwater moves through cracks. Dust settles where ancient dust settled before. The chamber that once held hyenas, bears, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern humans now holds instruments, excavation grids, labels, lights, and the careful attention of people trying to listen without inventing too much. It has become famous, but its fame rests on fragments that are almost invisible. That is fitting. Human origins were never going to be recovered as complete epic carved into stone. They return as bone splinters, tooth roots, ash smears, genetic traces, and sediment no one would have noticed without learning how to ask the right questions. So the cave remains both answer and question. It tells us that the human family was larger than remembered. It tells us that vanished people shaped the living. It tells us that extinction can leave inheritance, that strangers can become ancestors, and that the old borders between humankinds were crossed in bodies, not just in theories, but it also withholds the faces, the names, the voices, the final days, and most of the paths. Denisova Cave changed everything we knew about humans because it revealed that what we knew was never the whole story. Beneath its limestone roof, the missing parts still wait, not as fantasy, but as the quiet, unfinished truth of the ground. In the end, the cave gives back only what time has failed to destroy: a child's finger bone, a tooth with deep roots, a fragment from a body born of two ancient lineages, dust carrying the faint remains of people who never knew they would be searched for. These are small things, almost unbearably small when set against the thousands of generations they represent. Yet from them rises a different picture of humanity, less lonely, less straight, and more fragile than the one that once seemed certain. The story does not end with Denisovan stepping out of darkness fully restored. It ends with the recognition that much of the past will always remain partly dark. The missing face may never be found. The last Denisovan camp may never be identified. The final generation may have disappeared without a mark clear enough for science to recognize. But absence is no longer the same as nothing. The cave has taught us that what is missing may still have shaped the world, and that the living can carry traces of lives forgotten by every form of memory except inheritance. Snow still falls in the Altai, wind still moves along the valley, the cave mouth still opens in the rock, neither large nor theatrical, just a dark place in a pale landscape. Once, firelight trembled there. Once, hands worked stone and bone. Once, different kinds of humans passed through the same shelter, separated by time, joined by ancestry, and finally gathered again by science. They're gone now, but not entirely. A part of them remains in the questions they left behind, in the breath of mountain people, in the genomes of distant islands, in the cold sediment that held their presence long after their bodies disappeared. And perhaps that is the quietest truth Denisova gives us. Human history is not only what survives clearly, it is also what almost vanished, what waited in fragments, what changed us without being remembered. The cave keeps its darkness, but now that darkness is not empty, it is full of footsteps, ash, bone, and time, full of people who stood at the edge of our story before we knew they were there.